When I was planning on attending Augustine College's program, I thought that it was going to be a year of obtaining intellectual prowess. A year in which poor little old me would be transformed into a macho intellectual, able to tear down and destroy the evils of society. Maybe some of my classmates shared that view, maybe not, I don't know, I didn't actually ask them. But either way, I found this year to be slightly different than what I expected, and yet it was super valuable nonetheless. While I can definitely say it was a year of growth and transformation for each one of us, neither of those occurred in the way that I imagined. I didn't become Gigantic Josh, the conqueror of modern evil. But if that had happened, I would have chosen a better name than that. This, of course, is hyperbole, but it serves to demonstrate kind of what Alistair MacIntyre calls the superstition of modernity. A superstition being a belief in imaginary things, and that imaginary thing being belief in reason that can demonstrate truth to everyone through a neutral debate, or what we would consider a neutral debate. And I've been guilty of believing this and acting like it's true, and I'm sure many people here have as well. But Augustine did not serve to build this supreme intellect within me. So what was actually the point in coming? What actually happened? During Dr. Pachter's lectures in Science, Faith, and Medicine, our class journeyed through the Sermon on the Mount, amongst many other things. But it's through those brief sections at the beginning of class that I'd like to reflect on, I guess, one of the great themes throughout the year. So the Sermon on the Mount begins, and when he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth, and he taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." To be poor in spirit, though, what does this actually mean? And if it's how we get to the kingdom of heaven, then especially if we're Christians, we should be very concerned about what this is and how it relates to us. I remember back to, I think it was our first trivium lecture with Dr. Tingley, and I'm sure all of my classmates do as well. We refer to this one quite a lot. So think about this, a class that's on grammar and logic and rhetoric. Where else are you going to get the foundations to destroy arguments all over the place? Yet, in the beginning of the class, Dr. Tingley helped us to understand our past education. You can't read. You can't write. When will the insult cease? So basically, we were told that we needed to start at square one. We needed to relearn how to learn. Our past education had not done its job, and we had to begin from the beginning. If this was where intellectual greatness was to begin, the rest of the year just got a whole lot harder, because instead of starting halfway up the mountain, we were now at the foothills again. But this was the first step in bringing us to an intellectual attitude that consists of being impoverished in our spirit. The second and the binding step in leading us to recognize our intellectual poverty came through our study of Socrates throughout philosophy. We read through Socrates' trial in Plato's Apology, where Socrates gives his defense against his accusers, who claim that he's an evildoer, that a curious person who searches into things that are in heaven and under the earth and in the earth, and he's teaching these to other people. And Socrates, as you have probably heard of the Socratic method, he just asks questions. That's all he does. And he declares himself in that passage to possess a sort of wisdom. And this wisdom is a wisdom that doesn't presume to know the things that he doesn't actually know. He sees the error of the politicians, the poets, the artisans, and all of it is them extending their pseudo-knowledge to things that they don't actually know. They're proud, and therefore they're unteachable. The only way for them to be teachable is to let go of their pride, realize they don't know as much as they think they do. And I think as students coming to the college, this was a very important first lesson for us to receive. We don't know as much as we like to think sometimes, and we need to be ready to say, I don't know. So basically, the first lesson was, say you don't know. But to understand poverty in spirit only in terms of intellectual activity would be to do us a disservice. It would reduce what Jesus was actually saying to just one component of man, and not taking into account the whole human being. There's also a need for us to understand this in terms of our actions, how we relate to others. how we interact in our daily life. And from our understanding of the world as Christians, we were dead in sin. Before we came to salvation, we were dead, walking in the ways of darkness. Our natural powers, our passions, our intellect, and our reason, they can't be used as they should be as long as we're in that state. And we're in that state until we're moved by God, as Thomas Aquinas goes to say in his Summa. So within our study of Aquinas, there was a distinction that he made between the moral virtues and the theological virtues. And this is very closely tied to our poverty in spirit that we need to recognize. He notes that there are 4 moral virtues. There's justice, the knowledge of what's due to others; temperance, the ability to restrain ourselves from good things that aren't due in that situation; fortitude, the ability to encourage ourselves and our passions when we're disinclined to the proper thing; prudence, the knowledge of what's to be done. And these virtues are what our lives should be shaped around if we're living as we should, as human beings that are doing good and living as God intended us to. But he also declares that these are impossible without the theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and love. Faith is the fear of God. Hope is the ability to persevere in the faith and avoid despair in relation to God. And love is the ability to love God himself. And these are the virtues that connect us to God. They're given to us by God, and they are for strengthening our relationship with God. Since Aquinas says that we can't be good without these, we have to come to the conclusion that we can't really be good. So we're kind of impoverished in our spirits, not just intellectually, but in our actions as well. And I'm sure we could all just consider our actions each day and come to the same conclusion. We're not perfect. Throughout this year, there have been bumps and bruises, disagreements, miscommunications, and clearly, Daniel and I being roommates was a terrible idea. We didn't get along. That's false, just so you know. But if I were to paint a picture of this year being the ideal society of saints, as Miriam was talking about in our oral exam, that would be false. And that wouldn't be good for any of us here to be told. But this terrible, wretched condition, as I'm sure Dr. Blada would describe it, is the condition that we live in. But the first step for us to move forward from this is to recognize that it is so. By doing this, we have a foundation from which to move forward in. Only the sick that know they're ill can begin treatment. Only the exile, when he knows he's not home, can long for his lost land. And only when we know our deprived condition can we yearn for restoration. I'm not really sure what the class expected me to talk about when they elected me to do this, but I don't think that they expected me to go here, to say we don't know and that we can't be good. Kind of depressing. But this is the world we live in. This is the reality of every day. And as our class exits this year of study and moves forward in the different ways and the different directions that God is leading us, I think it's essential that we reflect and come back to this lesson, because it's the groundwork and the foundation that will help us to move forward. Christ came to seek and to save the lost. It's the sick that need a doctor, and each one of us is sick whether we recognize it or not. If we can acknowledge our depravity, our fallibility, and our limited understanding, the fact that we don't know and we can't do what we ought to do, we'll be more equipped to live as Christians in our society. As Dr. Patrick notes his one-word prayer, help, we'll be able to note and say that prayer ourselves. So class, remember all that you've learned, each Latin phrase and grammatical explanation, each philosopher and the propositions that explain their thinking, each book and poem that we've read through in literature, the scientists, the artists, passages of Scripture, and the historical church events. But most of all, remember who you are and what you are. You're a human being, a creature. And as a creature, you're dependent upon your Creator for your very life and sustenance. Don't believe the superstition of modernity, and don't be afraid to utter those dreadful words, I don't know. You will not live the perfect life, but by returning to this first beatitude, and the subsequent beatitudes as well, you will be transformed, not by your own strength, but as God works in you. Live your life in relation to God in weakness, in service, and forgiveness. Recognize your impoverished spirit and your need for God's work. and press forward in your pilgrimage to our heavenly abode. And as I close here, I think I'd like to read a short Puritan poem, just as we think about the closing of a year and the beginning of new things in our lives. And as Dr. Tingley has mentioned many times within prayers that he's read, since it's a personal prayer, take the singular pronoun, make it plural, because it's our prayer, my prayer for us. O love beyond compare, thou art good when thou givest, when thou takest away, and when the sun shines upon me, when the night gathers over me. Thou hast loved me before the foundation of the world, and in love didst redeem my soul. Thou dost love me still, in spite of my hard heart, ingratitude, and distrust. Thy goodness has been with me during another year, leading me through a twisting wilderness, in retreat helping me to advance, when beaten back, making sure headway. Thy goodness will be with me in the year ahead. I hoist sail and draw up anchor, with thee as the blessed pilot of my future as of my past. I bless thee that thou hast veiled my eyes to the waters ahead. If thou hast appointed storms of tribulation, thou wilt be with me in them. If I have to pass through tempests of persecution and temptation, I shall not drown. If I am to die, I shall see thy face the sooner. If a painful end is to be my lot, grant me grace that my faith fail not. If I am to be cast aside from the service I love, I can make no stipulation. Only glorify thyself in me, whether in comfort or trial, as a chosen vessel, meet always for thy use. Amen.